Hello and welcome to this workshop called How to Practice Yoga Safely. My name is Lexi Tavares with Healthy Dynamic Life, and I'll be your teacher today. Be sure to stick around till the end of this workshop where I give you my biggest secret on how to practice yoga safely and effectively. I know you're going to love it. How to do yoga safely. Let's start by going over my top 10 tips for practicing yoga safely. Tip number 1, avoid seeing yoga as a competition, even with yourself. Yoga is not a competitive sport. Pushing yourself past your limits puts you at a risk for injury. Furthermore, one of the benefits of yoga practice is the inward focus and sense of peace that it brings. Competition is a perfect antidote for inner peace. So if you find yourself comparing yourself to others or yourself at a previous time during a yoga practice, bring your attention back to your own body and mind. You can generally always find someone who's doing more challenging poses and someone who is doing beginner poses. The truth is, it doesn't matter how anyone else is doing their yoga, and there's no good or bad because who is to judge what is good and what is bad? Tip number 2 is to listen to your body and be in the moment. Yoga is all about being in the present moment. When we practice yoga asanas or yoga poses, it's a meditation in motion. So listen to what your body and breath are telling you and learn to adjust your practice accordingly. Is your breath fast and choppy? If so, scale back your physical practice until your breath becomes even again. Because we're not racing toward a finish line, and there's no prize for whoever has the most body aches after a practice. So keep coming back to your body, keep coming back to your breath, and keep coming back to exactly what's going on in this present moment. Tip number 3, challenge yourself, but don't strain yourself. Whichever style of yoga you choose to practice, remember that yoga is not just a workout, it's a work in. While the more physically athletic forms of yoga practice can be physically challenging as well as meditative, we need to find the balance between challenge and strain. You can hang out on the edge, but don't cross it. Tip number 4, forget about what you used to do. Our bodies and physical abilities change over time. They just do. But time doesn't have to limit our practice and experience of yoga. So if your mind wanders to what you were doing yesterday or 10 years ago, just notice that non-judgmentally and come back to this moment because this is where it's at. Tip number 5, don't buy into no pain, no gain. That feeling of physical exertion at just the right level where you find that sweet spot of alertness, engagement, and ease can be so exquisite. So go ahead, find your edge, and feel the joy of your body at work. But if you reach the point of a wince or if your breath becomes rapid, it's a direct message from your body that, hey, let's scale back a notch or 2. Thank you, body, for your messages. Tip number 6, find the intersection of focus and ease in your postures. The basic requirement for any yoga posture is a balance of alertness and focus and comfort or ease. So if you keep this in mind, you can avoid injury. What's easeful for you may be very different from what's easeful for another person. So knowing this, you can expect your postures to look different from any other person. Tip number 7, seek out a yoga teacher who respects your limits. Learn to recognize the difference between a teacher who encourages you to give it your best and one who tries to push your body beyond what it's capable of and your body's healthful limits. If your instructor is one of the latter, exercise your right to decide what you will do and what you won't do with your body in that class, and perhaps choose a different teacher next time. Tip number 8, find your personal comfort zone and your edge. Your yoga practice isn't a one-way street. Imagine that a teacher gives an instruction to take the pose to the next challenging level, but you find that it's just too much for you today. Well, guess what? You are allowed to decide what's best for yourself. Work at the level that suits you the best at that time and give yourself a pat on the back for having been curious and open to exploring just what that level is in that moment. Tip number 9, give yourself the benefit of time and allow your journey to unfold. Nowhere is it written that you must master a certain yoga asana or posture to have a thriving and beneficial yoga practice. If you hold on to a certain image of what a yoga practice or even a specific yoga posture should look like, and you push through regardless of the warning signs that your breath and body are giving you, you're bound to hurt yourself. So if you approach your practice with dedication and focus, as well as some loving kindness for yourself, you can experience the benefits that yoga offers, regardless of which postures work for your body or how your postures look compared to anyone else. Finally, tip number 10, choose function over form. How we look in a posture may not be as important as we once thought it was. Instead, we can focus on how the posture benefits our body and mind. So try not to muscle yourself into a posture, try to relax into it. Don't twist yourself into a posture when your body is unhappy with it, because that's a recipe for injury. Learn what simple adaptations enable you to reap the benefits of each posture without crossing the line into an unsafe practice. And that's what this workshop is all about. So let's dive into how to do yoga postures safely and how to know what's best for our bodies. So in order to know how to practice yoga safely, it's important to know a little bit about what's going on in our bodies. Because when we practice yoga asanas or yoga postures, we are putting our bodies into motion. So how exactly do we do that? Well, first of all, our body has a skeleton. Many of us probably know this from what we learned in school growing up, but the skeleton is made up of bones. And bones are like the structure of our bodies. So on our skeleton, we have the axial skeleton, like an axis, which consists of the skull, the spine, and the ribs, and the appendicular skeleton, which is like our appendages, right? Our limbs, our arms, our legs. So how do the bones move? Well, the bones move, thank you, to our muscles. Muscles either contract to flex to move a muscle, or they extend. So with the action of our muscles, we can move our bones at different joints. So joints are where bones meet. Now that's a very simple overview of how the body moves. Of course, there is so much more going on. We have ligaments and tendons and connective tissue and fascia, which Perhaps I'll make another video going into the nitty-gritty of this, but for the purposes of this workshop today, that's pretty much what we need to know. So we have many different joints in our bodies. Some of the main ones that we work with include our shoulders, our elbows, the wrists, the hips, the knees. We can do a little side action here. And the ankles. So that's pretty much, I mean, there are many other examples of joints in our bodies, but those are ones that we work with pretty often in our yoga practice. So the next thing I want to talk about is the different kinds of sensation that we can experience in a yoga practice, a yoga asana practice. One of the main things that we learn a lot about in a yoga class is the stretching sensation. And we might notice ourselves talking about this or others talking about feeling tight. Have you ever felt tight in your body before? I sure have, and that's one of the reasons that I'm attracted to continuing my yoga practice, is to work through that tightness and also to reduce the likelihood of it coming back. That's why a lot of people enjoy yoga asana practice. So the thing is, there's actually two different kinds of tightness that we can experience. And to be made aware of these two different kinds of tightness or sensation can drastically change our experience in our yoga practice and possibly create a more positive experience for us if, for example, in the past we've been met with frustration in certain yoga postures, or trying to take on the cues of our teacher and just our bodies being met with resistance. So the thing here is that there's two different kinds of tightness or sensation. One is tension and the other is compression. Let's explain the difference between tension and compression. Okay, so let's start with the elbow, because that's a pretty obvious example in my opinion. So take your arm and extend it out in front of you. I'm going to turn to the side so you can see me. And then take the opposite hand and hold the elbow so that the elbow itself isn't moving. Okay, so my palm is facing to the sky. My elbow is held firm in the opposite hand. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my wrist so that my thumb moves toward my midline as far as I can go, until I can't go anymore. And if, I could, then I'd have to actually engage my shoulder, which that's not what we're doing right now. So come back to your initial position, hold the elbow, and rotate the wrist. The reason that you can't move any further could be one of two reasons. It could be tension, which means the muscle is feeling stretched, or perhaps the connective tissue is tight and needs to be loosened up a little bit. If you're feeling sensation on the muscle, that might be the case. But if you're not really feeling a particular stretch in the muscle, that's compression. So compression is when two things, typically bones, are coming together, and that's what's preventing any additional range of motion. So what's really interesting is that some people might go 90 degrees, and that's as far as they can go until their bones meet. Some people can go past 180 degrees, and nothing is better or worse, good or bad objectively. It's just how our bodies are structured. So there's not much we can do about that. If our bones are built a certain way, to just keep stretching and stretching and stretching, I'm not quite sure if our bones will eventually move or not, but it's likely that that's our structure that we're given, and that's our range of motion when it comes to compressive tension. When it comes to compressive tightness. When it comes to tension, tensive tightness, that can be worked through, right? That stretching of the muscle or the fascia, that's what it feels really good when we come and keep practicing and open that up over time. Next, let's take a look at the shoulder joint. So the shoulder is pretty amazing. The shoulder is made up of the scapula, also commonly referred to as the shoulder blade. So you can probably feel it on your back. And it's actually a bone that glides along the back of the ribs. So it's not attached to the back ribs. Now, the humerus, or the upper arm bone, comes into the shoulder as a joint. So that's where they meet. Then the clavicle is the collarbone, which comes from the shoulder blade to the sternum, and that's actually where it attaches. So you're like, why are we learning about the bones of the shoulder? I'll show you, it's really cool. So one of the motions of the shoulder joint is flexion, which means when I take my arm and I bring it this way, that's flexion in front of my body. Extension, when I take the humerus in relation to the shoulder and bring it back. Then we have abduction, which means going away. Think abduction, going away. And adduction, thinking adding, coming together towards the midline. Then we have external rotation, where my shoulder rotates outward toward the back, and then internal rotation, where it comes in toward the midline of the body. So let's start with flexion, okay? So if I bring my arm, and bring both of my arms up, some of us might only get to here. And there could be two reasons. Can you remember what they are? It could be tension or it could be compression. So as I come up here, if I'm feeling tension in the muscles that's preventing my arm from moving any further, that's okay, right? That's a good thing. We can work with that edge and loosen that up over time through our yoga practice. But for example, let's say that there's no tension, and I'm bringing my arm up, and I feel the tightness, the sensation in my shoulder joint in the back. That could be compression. The way that the bone structure is in one's body who feels that, it's bone on bone. There's nothing we could do to bring the arm back any further. And so this is where all of our bodies are different. And they're going to look differently for everybody in different poses. So for example, some of us might, without tension, come to here and experience compression. Some of us might come to 180 degrees and then experience compression. Some of us might even be able to go beyond and then experience compression. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're feeling that attention, that focus, and that ease and that comfort. So that's flexion in our shoulder as we keep it level. Okay, that's keeping my shoulder blades level the whole time. Now for some of us, that's a good sensation, that's a good stretch. Going here is comfortable. But if we're not feeling any tension, we're just feeling compression, then maybe we start to lift the scapula, lift the shoulder blades, so it looks like our shoulders are coming to our ears, and then maybe we can extend our arms further behind us. And then maybe we feel a good stretch. So you might have heard in your yoga classes, in certain poses, press your shoulders away from your ears. Now, they probably have a good intention, the teacher, for sharing that, Maybe that feels really good in their body, or that's what they were taught. But the thing is, that doesn't necessarily account for everybody's different bone structure and what's going to feel the best in their body, right? Because if I have flexion and then boom, compression, and I'm not feeling anything, maybe by lifting my scapula and allowing my humerus bone to come around the joint, then maybe, oh yeah, that feels good. So who's to say what's right and what's the wrong way of expressing a yoga posture? I mean, nobody really to say like, I'm the judge of all the yoga postures and I say this is right is kind of playing God, and that's not really the point of yoga. The point is to find inner peace and be in the present moment and get all the good feelings, the benefits out of yoga. So letting go of what's right, what's wrong, and doing what your body and your breath are telling you in the moment is really working in alignment with who you are in this present moment, and there's so many benefits to be had. So another thing that happened for me when I brought my arms up, coming back to the shoulder joint, and I encourage you to do this along with me if you haven't already, lifting your arms and seeing where you stop, keeping your shoulders down. Where do you feel compression, right? That's where the bones are meeting each other. Then, what happens to allow yourself to go back a little further? What's happening for me is I'm externally rotating my shoulders a little bit so that the humerus bone can get around and so I can feel that stretch. Now, can you think of any postures that would be affected by our shoulder structure, our individual shoulder structure? I can think of a few. Downward facing dog, wheel. What other postures can you think of that could be affected by our shoulder joint? Let me know in the comments below. So let's take a look at how this affects our downward facing dog, Adho Mukha Svanasana. So come onto your mat and let's try this together. Starting in child's pose, Balasana, extending your arms in front. Good, and then coming onto all fours, tucking the toes under and sending the hips toward the sky. Pressing all your fingers into the mat. And notice how you're experiencing the pose today. Notice how you feel in your shoulders. Do you feel sensation in the muscles? Do you feel compression? How are you maneuvering your shoulders to get the sensation in this pose? Keep breathing in downward facing dog and play around with the positioning of your shoulders. When a teacher cues you to press your shoulders away from your ears, how does that feel in your body? What if I said, bring your shoulders up towards your ears, moving the scapula up? What happens to your humerus bone, the upper arm bone? What happens to the placement of your elbow? What happens if you try to externally rotate your shoulders or internally rotate your shoulders? What kind of range of motion are you experiencing today? And notice, is the sensation you're experiencing tension or compression? Tension, muscle tightness, or compression, bone on bone? With tension, you can stay there, keep breathing, and allow that sensation to move through your body. Maybe experience more ease as you continue to breathe. With compression, that's where you're at. So maybe downward facing dog is an effective pose for you. Maybe it's not. Maybe adjusting the placement of your shoulders would make an effective choice, but maybe it's not. So the point here is to connect with your own body, your breath, and the messages that your body is telling you to make the yoga posture effective for you. Instead of thinking in terms of what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, what should the pose look like versus am I doing it right, think about what's effective for your body. And don't worry about looking a certain way. Someone else's expression is going to look totally different than yours, and that's a-okay. So for me, I feel comfortable until about this point. That's where I feel compression in my shoulder joint. If I move my scapula and externally rotate my shoulders, I can get a deeper stretch in the muscle. Send us a video of you playing with downward facing dog in the comments below. I'd love to see. Now, while we're on the topic of Adho Mukha Svanasana, downward facing dog, I want to talk about how you can make the posture work for you. I've been in so many different yoga classes and I've been told so many different cues for Adho Mukha Svanasana that sometimes I feel like I'm going crazy and I start to wonder, am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? What's the right way? Someone just tell me the right way. So when our mind goes there, it's okay. Just notice that non-judgmentally and come back to what is the body telling me it wants and what would be effective for reaching my goals. So for me, I'm working on the tension in the backs of my legs. So if you notice, when I went into Adho Mukha Svanasana, I had a lot of mobility in my shoulders, but my heels were off the ground and I felt a lot of tension, tightness in the back of my legs. So it really depends on what your goal is, what simple adjustments you can make to come into that balance of focus, attention, and comfort and ease. So if I'm to come into downward facing dog, using the breath, right? I have a lot of mobility in my shoulders, but I'm feeling a lot of tension in the backs of my legs. So really, what is effective for you here? It's going to be different for everyone. So I might start by bending my knees and getting a nice stretch, lengthening in my spine. I'm also working on correcting some scoliotic curves. So when my goal is to really stretch the back and lengthen my spine, this feels really good for me. Now, as I shift my goal, my attention on lengthening the back of my legs to release some tension there, I want to straighten my legs, maybe even tilt my pelvis. Ooh, yeah, I'm feeling that. Playing with pressing my heels into the floor. Now, for some of us, it might be more effective if we feel a lot in our shoulders, like it's just too much there. We can shorten the distance between our hands and our feet to shift some of that weight out of the front half of our body, right, the upper part of our body, and into the legs. That's another option that could be available to you. So walk my legs a little bit closer, and now I feel like my weight is more evenly distributed. So in a pose like Adho Mukha Svanasana, where we get that lengthening in the spine and the back, opening that up, the flexion in the shoulders, the opening of the backs of the legs, it's going to be different for every practitioner what their focus is and what their goal is. So for you, what is your goal in this moment for downward facing dog? It might be different than 2 breaths ago. It might be different than yesterday. That's okay. Just be willing and open to making the adjustments that work for your body, because that's the whole point, to make it work and effective for you. We're not trying to fit a cookie cutter design of what the pose should look like to boost our ego and look like the models on Instagram. The point is to go within, feel good, feel at peace, and get all the benefits. So for downward facing dog, that's a pose that for me, I'm really working on all the time. And when I shift into my inner awareness and what my body is telling me versus what I think I should look like because this is what my teacher said or this is what it looked like in a book, oh, it's like a weight is lifted off my shoulder and I can actually really be present in my practice. Let's talk about another joint that can be affected by tension and compression, the ankle joint. So our ankles can move in various directions. Go ahead and give your ankles a nice roll one way, the other way. In many of our poses, we flex our ankles, bring our toes toward our head, or we point our toes away, extend. So find yourself in a squatting position. As you can see, my heels are off the ground. Some people can squat like this with their heels on the ground, no problem. Some of us, our heels lift up off the ground. Now as I stand up, you can see that my heels were able to touch the ground about here. So finding that place where my heels are pressing against the floor, where do I feel the tightness? Okay, if you feel the tightness on the backs of your legs, that's tension. But if you feel it in the front of your ankle, that's compression. And as you continue to move your glutes towards the floor, the angle, it can't go any further because the bones are meeting. That's compression. So no matter what you do, you'll never get your heels on the floor in a squatting position. Now, that's not good, it's not bad, it's just, it is what it is. It might be helpful in some poses if you have that ankle mobility, and it might be less helpful in other poses, but it just is what it is. So play with this yourself, see if you can get your heels on the floor, and where you feel that sensation. Is it compression or is it tension? Because if it's tension, we can work through that. If it's compression, it is what it is. So that's another joint that is affected in Adho Mukha Svanasana, downward facing dog. So if you come back into downward facing dog and you're feeling tension in the back of your legs, that can be worked through. But if you are already heels on the floor in your fullest expression and the angle of your ankle flexion is at its capacity, there's nowhere else for it to go. That's okay. Another joint I'd like to talk about is the hip. The hip is where the femur bone, the upper leg bone, comes into our pelvis. And this is a ball and socket joint, so we can move our hips flexion, right? Bringing the leg up. We can extend the leg behind. We can abduct, right? Move away. And we can adduct, move towards. We can also externally rotate our hip, right? Outwards, or we can internally rotate our hip as well. So the first example I want to talk about here is abduction. Bringing the leg out. Now, if you feel tension on the inner thigh, that is workable. We can stretch that out. But if you feel compression in here, I feel a really intense sensation here, that's compression, right? No matter what I do, that's not going to move up any further because that's bone on bone. That's just how my joint is, okay? Now, when it comes to the hips with flexion and extension, there's a lot going on in the pelvis. There are a lot of muscles, a lot of connective tissue. There's a lot going on. So it can be a little bit more of a challenge to decipher if a certain sensation is tension or compression. So in instances where you're doing a forward fold, for example, a form of flexion, it's just a good idea to get in tune with your breath and body. Find your edge, that area of a little bit of a challenge, and where you can ease into the pose and find comfort. I wish I had more tips on how to decipher between tension and compression when we're specifically talking about flexion in the hips, but I don't. And so again, coming back to that advice of tuning into the signals from your body and breath and doing your best to choose effective adjustments for yourself. Now, according to one of my yoga anatomy teachers, Paul Grilly, most of us are either inclined toward external rotation or internal rotation. And again, that's just the way our bodies were built. So there are many poses that our internal or external rotation can affect. So for example, let's come into goddess pose. So bring the feet wide apart, turn the toes out toward the side, and send the glutes down toward the ground as you bend the knees. And you might hear your teacher cue, keep the knees over the toes and try to come into a straight line. Okay, now if I go sideways, you'll see that I'm not quite in a straight line, but I'm close. I have a natural tendency toward external rotation. That might have to do with my ballet training growing up and the development of my bones when I was young. Now, if you ask someone who meets compression a lot sooner, that's not what it's gonna look like for them, right? So if I come into goddess pose, but boom, I'm in compression here, now it's never gonna look like I'm in a straight line no matter what, because bone on bone in the joint is here. No matter what I do, no matter how much I stretch, this bone isn't going anywhere. So that's another reason to let go of judgment, let go of what a pose should look like, and come back to focusing on what's effective. This is also going to affect poses like frog, right? So come into frog, bring the knees out to the side, line your hips up with your knees, bring your ankles in alignment with your knees. Now, if you have a natural tendency toward external rotation, you might be flat on the floor. But if you're experiencing compression in that hip joint, you might be up here, and that's okay, right? The whole point is choosing poses that are effective for you and feel good for you. What are some other poses where compression in the hips are going to affect us? Some other examples of yoga asanas that are affected by our external rotation of our hips and our body structure include seated poses where our knees are out to the side, such as Sukhasana, Padmasana, Baddha Konasana, right? If I have compression in my hips right here, no matter what, they're not going anywhere because that's bone on bone. And this could be really uncomfortable, right? In order to sit here, I might have to roll my back over like this, and I might not be getting a lot out of this posture. So what we can do is adjust ourselves in the posture to make it work for us. One thing that tends to help if you are someone that experiences compression in the hips with external rotation is you could sit on a blanket and elevate the hips. And that might be a little bit helpful. Another option is to take the 3-minute eggs and use them to support your legs as well. So much better. Now I can get my spine straight and I feel supported. And as I um, adjust the props to make it work for me, right? Maybe I have a little bit more range of motion in my hip joint, then I can bring the 3-minute eggs out and use them how I like. Another place that we can experience the varying degrees of compression is in our neck. So if I turn to the side here and I bring my head back towards my spine, I can go all the way back. But that's not the case for everybody. Some people can just go a certain range of motion, a certain number of degrees, and without feeling any tension in the front of the neck muscles, they feel compression in the back of the neck. Again, it's not good, it's not bad, it just is. But being aware of that place of compression in your body, you will notice how you express certain postures. So in, for example, various back bends, you might notice some people's necks are all the way back and some people's are not. That's okay. In other classes I've been in, teachers have said to avoid bringing the head back to avoid injury. Well, why would I do that when I feel comfortable extending my head back? Why would I stop myself from expressing myself fully in the pose and feeling that sensation? Why would I hold myself back purposefully? So by allowing ourselves to express ourselves fully, wherever that may be for us, is a form of self-love. Let's now talk about Urdhva Danurasana, or upward facing bow pose, commonly referred to as wheel. Wheel is a really fun pose. I enjoy it. Heart opening. Can be a really intense pose too. So when we look at this posture through the lens of tension versus compression, where would we be feeling tension in the body, if at all? Right? When we think about this, compression would be the sensation we feel in the direction of the motion. So for example, with our first movement we practiced today, holding the elbow and moving the wrist toward the midline, I feel compression in the direction that I'm going, right? If I felt tension on the opposite side, that would be tension. Similarly, if I flex my shoulder, if I lift my arms up, compression is in the direction that I'm going, right? Here at this joint. If I felt sensation on the opposite side, that would be tension. So when it comes to wheel, there's a lot going on. Or, Urdhva Danurasana, upward facing bow. I'm just so used to calling it wheel from my history, but it's all good. So if we have compression in our shoulders that limit our mobility, our range of motion, our wheel might look different than someone else. We might never get our shoulders over our wrists or beyond our wrists like some people can. And that's okay. It's not about what it looks like. Function over form, right? What's going to feel good and be effective for you in meeting your goals. So similarly, we might notice our tension in our quadricep muscles and our hip flexors. If they are tight, that might limit us from lifting the pelvis toward the sky. If the situation is not tension though, it might be an issue of compression, right? Just the way that our bones are might prevent us from lifting the pelvis any higher. No matter how much we stretch the front of our legs and our teacher can say, lift, 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 and we're like, I'm at my maximum point, that's okay. That's okay. Just work with where you're at. Another example is you might feel a stretch in your abdominal muscles. That's tension. That's good. That's okay. We can continue to work on that by getting into Urdhva Danurasana and practicing, right? And breathing into it. However, if we're experiencing compression in the back, that's as far as we can go, right? Just like we did with the neck. How far we go back depends on how our bones are structured in our spine and when they meet. So something that I learned that is really interesting and cool is about back bending. And a lot of teachers instruct in classes to focus on the thoracic spine or the upper back. And I think that this comes from a good intention because some of us put a lot of weight into the low back and can experience a lot of pain and really press into that compression point. However, I learned that where the ribs meet the spine, which is our thoracic spine, right? That's where our ribs meet the spine. We have our cervical spine, which is the bones in the neck. Then the thoracic spine, T1 through T12, where the ribs come to the spine. And then the lumbar spine, which is below the thoracic spine. And then we have our sacrum, right, which is fused together in our pelvis. So that's a little background of the spine. So where the ribs meet the spine, the thoracic spine, there actually isn't that much mobility because the ribs are there. So when we go into a back bend, what we're actually moving is our lumbar spine and our shoulder blades. Ooh, coming back to the shoulder joint. So how we show up in our back bending poses has a lot to do with our lumbar spine, the point of compression, and our shoulder mobility. So when we come into Urdhva Danurasana, you might hear your teacher say to focus on bending the thoracic or the upper back. What they probably mean is to focus on contracting the shoulders, opening the chest, and what that means is moving the scapula, not necessarily the spine where the ribs are attached. Now, the lumbar spine might be here, right? You might have this range of motion. You might have a very flexible back. It really just depends on your bone structure and where you meet your point of compression. Now, it also could be an issue of tension in the abdominal muscles, which is fine, we can work with that. But if it's compression, that's as far as you can take it. So if you haven't already done so, let's come into Urdhva Danurasana. Keep breathing and play around with what feels good in your body. Where do you sense tension? And if you feel tension, that's okay. Keep breathing. That's one of the benefits of practicing. But if you feel compression, notice that and stay there, or maybe ease off a little bit, right? A little bit of compression is good. In fact, that can help strengthen bones over time. But we don't want to go too far and try to push the bones past where they can go because they can only go so far. Another factor that can affect how we show up in yoga asanas is proportion. Believe it or not, our bones are all the same in people, right? There's an expression in Southeast Asia I learned called same but different. We have the same skeletal structure, but there's nuances that change, right? Some people's humerus is longer, some people's are shorter. Same with the femur bone, same with all the bones. Some of the shapes might vary slightly. The positioning of the joints, the way the joints fit into each other. That's why we all experience compression differently. So proportion is another factor that affects how we perform yoga postures. So for example, I first discovered this for myself in Danurasana, step pose. So if I turn to the side, come join me in Danurasana. Sit up nice and tall, send the legs straight out in front of you and flex the feet, and then take your palms and plant them on the floor. If you zoom in, you can tell my palms are not touching the floor. No matter how much I push through my hands, through my arms, through my shoulders, my proportion is just not built that way. My arm isn't long enough to meet the floor. So what can I do? Can I just never practice Danurasana? No, of course I can. I can use props to assist me. Now a block might be too high, but with the 3-minute eggs, I can adjust my placement on the egg to work for me. Another option could be to use a folded blanket because then I can adjust the height depending on how many folds I use. So let's try folded blanket. Ta-da! My hand touches the blanket. So with using props, I can bring the floor up to me and then I can explore the expressions of these postures. Let's try the 3-minute eggs. Now the 3-minute eggs are a little bit too high for me. So you see my scapula start to hike up. So that's the fun of playing with props, is getting to explore what works for your body and what's effective towards meeting your goals and feeling good. Can you think of any other examples where proportion would affect our expression in yoga asanas? Let me know in the comments below. The last topic I want to talk about today is orientation. How we orient ourselves can affect the way that we feel in a yoga asana. This is probably my favorite part about yoga anatomy and how to practice yoga safely and tailor it to each of our own specific needs. So the orientation is how we orient ourselves. So for example, we could take a twist, simply twisting our spine, and really what we're doing in a twist is we're orienting our pelvis in relation to our shoulders, right? We're twisting our spine, but what's happening is our shoulders are changing direction in relation to our hips, to our pelvis. So let's lie down on our backs. And you can bring your arms out to the side if that feels comfortable. And now bring your knees to your chest. And now send your knees over to one side. What do you notice happening in your body? And what do you tend to hear in yoga classes if you've ever been to one? I've been to yoga classes where teachers say, plant your knees on the earth or use props to bring the earth up to your knees. Bring your hand to your knees to press them down to the earth. I've been in other classes where teachers have instructed to keep the opposite shoulder on the earth. Now, does it really matter where our knees are? Does it really matter where our shoulder is? Like, who cares? Who's to judge? This is how this yoga pose should look. That's not the point of yoga. The point is to be effective and to feel good in your body. So how you orient yourself, you might feel something different and there might be an expression that's more beneficial to you. So I invite you to come back if you've come out of your twist and play with keeping the shoulder down and then bringing the knees to one side. You could always take some blocks or a blanket to support the knees. And if you look at your body or if you feel into your body, Where are your shoulders in relation to your pelvis? Right? You have a maximal twist to the best of your ability until you reach tension or compression. Now, if you allow your shoulder to come off the ground and you let your knees fall to the ground, how do you feel differently or similarly? The relation of your hips, your pelvis to your shoulders, it might be the same, but the orientation has changed. Therefore, you're experiencing perhaps a different expression of the pose. Maybe both your knee and your shoulder are off the ground and you're supported by props, and maybe that's the most effective way for you to be in that posture. How cool is that? Just by changing our orientation, we're still in the same position, essentially, because our shoulders are twisted to the same degree as it is in each expression, but the orientation is shifted, and we can use that to our advantage to come into the most effective expression for ourselves. Another example of using orientation to our advantage in yoga asanas is in our back bends. So I'd like you to come into a low lunge. So you can come into a kneeling position, bring one foot in front of you, and come into a low lunge. Then you can come into a back bend. You can bring your arms up, cactus arms, or to the back to support you. Woo! And take a couple deep breaths here. And now come into your fullest expression of a back bend in this pose. What are you noticing? Where do you feel tension? Where do you feel compression? Where do you feel gravity acting on your body? How does that feel? Notice where you're at in a back bend in a low lunge. When you're ready, come out of it. Good. Now, if we were to come onto our bellies on the ground and come into bow. How do you feel? Where do you feel tension? Where do you feel compression? Where do you feel gravity working on your body? Still a back bend, different orientation. Now, let's come into camel. So coming up on the knees, tucking the toes under if that feels good for you, bringing the hands to the low back, and then the ankles, coming into your back bend. How does that feel in your body? Where do you feel tension? Where do you feel compression? And where do you feel gravity? And when you're ready, you can come out. Which expression of a back bend was most effective for you? Because guess what? There's no right or wrong answer. They're all back bends, but you're oriented differently. Gravity is working on you differently. You can use that to your advantage, or it might be disadvantageous to you, and that's okay. So comment below which form of back bend, which form of twist you liked the best. Let's explore forward bending in various orientations. So let's come into our seated forward fold, Paschimottanasana. Come into Dandasana staff pose, legs extended out in front of you, and fold forward, breathing in and breathing out. Noticing, where do you most sense tension? Where do you sense compression? Where do you sense gravity? How do you feel overall in this expression of your forward fold? Take another deep breath in and out, and slowly come up. Come to a standing position on your mat. We're going to practice Uttanasana, a standing forward fold. So hinging at the waist and folding forward. Keep breathing. Notice, where do you sense tension, compression, and gravity? How do you feel overall in this expression of your forward fold? Keep breathing, and when you feel complete, you can come back to standing. Another expression of a forward fold is halasana, or plow pose. So come on to your back. And using some momentum, bring your feet over your shoulders and let your legs come down towards the floor. Where do you feel tension? Do you feel any compression? How do you feel gravity in this pose? Keep breathing. How do you feel overall in this posture? Keep breathing. And when you feel complete, you can come out of the pose the same way you came in. I used to feel so frustrated going to yoga classes, hearing contradictory cues from different teachers, and not being sure what is the right way to practice yoga. What is the right way to do the yoga poses? And it drove me nuts until I realized there is no right or wrong way. There are more effective ways and ways that are in alignment with my structure and what feels good in my body according to my body signals and my breath. So today we covered compression versus tension for sensations that we notice in the body by being aware of whether a sensation or a tightness is tension or compression. That gives us information on how to best express ourselves in the posture. We talked about proportion and how we can use props to assist us in still playing with various postures that might not have been accessible to us simply because of the proportion of our bone structure. And lastly, we talked about orientation, how we can find ourselves expressing various twists or forward folds or back bends or a number of different expressions in yoga. But by changing the orientation, we might get a better stretch or a better experience in the yoga practice. So tell me, what was your favorite tidbit from today's workshop? I'd love to know. Let me know in the comments below. If you're interested in learning more tips about yoga, health, wellness, recipes, and everything about living your most healthy, dynamic life, definitely click the button to subscribe to the channel. And I wish you a happy, healthy, and dynamic day. Bye. Thanks so much for joining. Namaste.